She collapsed on a frozen mountain road with nothing but a worn suitcase and a fading heartbeat. No family, no home, just snow, silence, and the slow realization that no one was coming. Miles Carter wasn't looking for anyone that night. A man who had already survived too many fires, too many losses, driving through the storm with only his German shepherd beside him. But when his headlights cut through the blizzard and revealed a woman kneeling in the snow, fate refused to stay silent. One decision, one open door, and 3 broken lives that were never meant to meet. What happens next will make you believe in quiet miracles and second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. If you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, hit subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope. Silver Pine Valley, Montana, had a way of making people feel small, even on clear days. Nestled between long stretches of pine forest and low, jagged mountain ridges, the town lived at the mercy of the seasons. Winter ruled longer here than anywhere else. Snow arrived early, stayed late, and never apologized for the damage it left behind. Roads vanished overnight, power lines sagged beneath the weight of ice, and when storms came down from the mountains, they did so with the confidence of something ancient and unstoppable. That evening, the storm arrived without ceremony. The sky collapsed into itself, heavy and gray, as wind tore through the valley and drove snow sideways across the highway. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. The road leading out of town, State Route 14, was no longer a road at all, but a pale, shifting surface that erased direction and distance alike. The world had narrowed to cold, sound, and survival. Eleanor Whitmore walked alone through it. She was 67 years old, though the way she moved suggested someone older, someone who had learned to conserve energy the way others learned to save money. Eleanor was of average height, her frame thin but not fragile, shaped by years of standing on hospital floors and lifting bodies heavier than her own. Her back was still straight, almost stubbornly so, a habit formed long ago, when posture had been the only thing she could control. Her hair, once auburn, had faded into a soft silver gray and was tucked beneath a knitted wool hat that had lost its elasticity years earlier. Strands escaped anyway, plastered against her pale cheeks by freezing wind. Her skin was fair and weathered, marked with fine lines that spoke not of vanity lost, but of endurance earned. There was something gentle in her face, particularly around the eyes, but also a quiet resolve, the kind seen in people who had survived more than they ever expected to. Eleanor wore a long, dark coat that hung loosely on her frame, its buttons mismatched from years of careful repair. Beneath it, layers of sweaters did their best to trap warmth, though the cold still found its way through. Her gloves were torn at the fingertips. Her boots, practical but worn, filled slowly with snow. In her right hand, she dragged a small fabric suitcase, brown and frayed at the edges. One wheel was missing, forcing her to pull it at an angle. The case bumped and scraped against the frozen ground, leaving a thin, uneven trail behind her before the wind erased it again. Inside the suitcase were the remnants of a life reduced to what could be carried. 2 changes of clothes, a folded cardigan, a worn leather wallet with no cash, a faded photograph of a young man smiling beside a lake, and a Bible whose pages were soft from use. Eleanor did not look inside the suitcase anymore. She knew exactly what it held, and exactly what it didn't. She leaned into the wind and took another step. The snow stung her eyes. Her breath came, out in short, shallow bursts, visible only for a moment before being swallowed by the storm. The road stretched ahead of her in endless white. She had lost all sense of how far she'd walked, only that she had been walking for a long time, and that stopping felt more dangerous than continuing. Earlier that afternoon, she had left Silver Pine Assisted Living with nothing but that suitcase and a polite apology. The facility had closed abruptly. Funding cut, staff dismissed, residents relocated, those with families anyway. Eleanor had no one to call. Her son Daniel had been gone for years, lost somewhere between bad decisions and worse luck. Letters returned unopened, phone numbers disconnected. At some point, hoping had begun to feel like a luxury she could no longer afford. So, she walked. She told herself she would reach the next town by nightfall. She told herself the storm would ease. She told herself many things, because telling herself nothing at all felt too close to surrender. The wind howled louder. Her foot slipped on a patch of ice hidden beneath fresh snow. Eleanor stumbled, catching herself just before she fell, though the effort sent a sharp pain through her knee. She paused, bracing herself against the suitcase handle, chest heaving. For a moment, she considered sitting down. The thought frightened her more than the cold. Eleanor had seen what happened to people who sat down in storms like this. As a young nurse, she had worked emergency rooms during brutal winters, had watched frostbite claim fingers and hypothermia steal consciousness gently, almost kindly. She knew the signs, the false warmth, the quiet, the temptation to rest. "No," she whispered aloud, her voice nearly torn from her by the wind. "Not yet." She forced herself to keep moving. The highway was empty. No headlights pierced the snow, no sound of engines reached her ears, just wind and the faint crunch of her boots and the soft dragging thud of the suitcase behind her. The isolation pressed in from every direction. It felt as though the world had narrowed down to her alone, walking through a place that no longer remembered her name. Eleanor's thoughts drifted, as they often did when her body grew tired. She remembered long nights in hospital corridors, the smell of antiseptic and old coffee, the steady beep of monitors. She remembered holding hands with men who cried for their mothers as they died, and women who apologized for taking up space even as pain consumed them. She remembered learning how to be calm when everything around her was breaking. She had been good at that, being calm, being useful, being the one who stayed when others left. Perhaps that was why she was here now. Her fingers had gone numb. She could no longer feel the suitcase handle, only the tension in her arm. Her breath began to slow, not from rest, but from exhaustion. The cold seeped deeper, past layers of wool and memory. Then, without warning, her strength gave way. It wasn't dramatic. There was no cry, no sudden collapse, just a subtle misstep, a knee that refused to straighten, a body that had finally reached its limit. Eleanor sank into the snow, the suitcase tipping over beside her. She tried to push herself up. Her arms trembled. Her hands slipped. The effort stole what little breath she had left. So, she stopped trying. Snow gathered on her coat, melting slightly before freezing again. Her lashes clung together with ice. The storm continued its relentless march across the valley, indifferent to the small figure kneeling at the edge of the road. Eleanor closed her eyes. She thought of Daniel, not as the troubled man he had become, but as the boy he once was, barefoot by the lake, laughing, calling her mom. "I hope you're warm," she murmured, though she wasn't sure if she meant him or herself. The wind softened for just a moment, as if listening. Eleanor's breathing slowed. Her grip on the suitcase loosened. The road stretched on. Ahead, blank and silent, waiting to be reclaimed by morning, or not at all. Somewhere in the distance, unseen beyond the storm, fate was already moving. But Eleanor Whitmore did not know that yet. For now, there was only snow, and the quiet courage of a woman who had not given up, only paused. The road had disappeared long before Miles Carter noticed it. State Route 14 no longer looked like asphalt or gravel or anything shaped by human hands. It was a pale, shifting surface, erased and rewritten every few seconds by the wind. Snow rolled across it in low waves, hissing against the undercarriage of the old pickup truck, as if the valley itself were breathing. The headlights cut narrow tunnels through the white, but the light never traveled far. 10 feet ahead, maybe less, before it dissolved into the storm. Miles drove slowly, both hands on the wheel, posture rigid but controlled. He was 42, tall and powerfully built, with the broad shoulders of a man who had spent years hauling hoses, axes, and bodies through smoke and flame. His dark hair was cut short and uneven, more practical than stylish, and streaked with premature gray at the temples. A rough beard shadowed his jaw, the kind that never quite disappeared no matter how closely he shaved. His face bore sharp angles, a straight nose broken once long ago, and eyes the color of wet steel, steady, watchful, distant. He had learned not to rush storms. Years earlier, during the Cedar Creek fire, rushing had cost lives. Miles had been a wildland firefighter then, part of an elite response unit sent to contain a blaze that moved faster than forecasts predicted. Wind shifted. Flames jumped the line. 3 men didn't make it out. Miles did. That fact had rearranged something inside him permanently, leaving behind a quiet weight he carried everywhere, heavier than any gear pack. Now, long after he'd left the service, storms still pulled him onto the road. Silence inside the truck felt safer than silence inside his head. In the back seat sat Axel. The German Shepherd was 7 years old, large even for his breed, with a thick black and tan coat that had grown coarser with age. One ear stood upright. The other bore a slight tear near the tip, folded just enough to give him a perpetually thoughtful expression. His amber eyes were alert but calm, tracking the blur of movement beyond the windows. A faint scar traced along his left shoulder beneath the fur, hidden unless you knew where to look. Axel had been a search and rescue dog once, trained to move through smoke and rubble, to find what others missed. Miles had pulled him from a burn zone during that same fire, carrying him out when a collapsing tree sent debris through the line. Neither of them had been the same afterward. They understood each other now, without commands. The truck's heater rattled weakly. Miles adjusted the dial, though it made little difference. Cold seeped in anyway, settling into his bones. His thoughts drifted, dangerous and unfocused, until Axel shifted suddenly, standing up and bracing his paws against the seat. "What is it?" Miles muttered. Axel let out a low sound, not a bark, not a growl, something in between. Miles leaned forward, squinting through the windshield. At first, there was nothing but snow. Then, at the far edge of the headlight's reach, a shape appeared. Dark, low, wrong. He slowed instinctively, foot easing onto the brake. The shape resolved into a person. Miles's chest tightened. Jesus! The figure was kneeling, or maybe collapsed, near the shoulder of the road, half buried in snow. A small suitcase lay tipped over beside her like something abandoned. She didn't move. Axel's posture changed completely. His body went taut, focused, the way it used to when he caught a scent or signal. He let out a sharp bark, once, urgent. "I see her," Miles said quietly, though he wasn't sure who he was reassuring. Every instinct drilled into him over years of fieldwork surged forward. Stop, assess, secure the scene. But another voice, older, quieter, shaped by survival rather than protocol, whispered caution. Storms didn't forgive mistakes. Neither did isolated roads. He could keep driving. No one would know. Miles brought the truck to a stop anyway. The tires crunched as they settled into the snow. Wind rocked the vehicle gently, insistently, as if testing his resolve. For a moment, Miles just sat there, staring through the glass at the motionless figure ahead. His breath fogged the windshield. Axel whined softly. "All right," Miles exhaled. "All right." He pulled on his coat and stepped out into the storm. The cold hit him like a physical force. Wind tore at his jacket, driving snow into his face and down his collar. His boots sank deep with every step, each movement deliberate as he approached the woman. The suitcase lay open now, its contents half spilled and dusted white. She was older than he had expected. Up close, Miles could see the silver hair peeking out from beneath her hat, the fine lines etched deeply around her eyes and mouth. Her coat was soaked through in places, dark with melted snow. Her hands, bare at the fingertips, were bluish with cold. "Ma'am," he called, raising his voice over the wind. "Can you hear me?" No response. He knelt beside her, careful, practiced. Her breathing was shallow but present. He pressed 2 fingers gently against her neck, counting, slow, too slow. "Hypothermia," he muttered. Axel circled them, positioning himself between the woman and the open road, ears forward, body alert. Snow clung to his fur, but he didn't seem to notice. Miles shrugged off his coat and wrapped it around the woman's shoulders, tucking it in as best he could. Her eyelids fluttered. "Hey," he said, softer now. "Stay with me." Her eyes opened briefly, pale blue, unfocused. Her lips moved. "Don't stop," she whispered, though the words barely carried. "I'm not," Miles said. "You are." He lifted her carefully. She was lighter than he expected, all sharp bones and fragile weight. The effort sent a familiar strain through his arms, one he welcomed. Purpose always steadied him. Axel followed closely as Miles carried her back to the truck, tail stiff, gaze scanning the storm. Miles opened the passenger door and eased the woman inside, adjusting the seat to lay her back gently. He cranked the heater to its highest setting and grabbed a thermal blanket from behind the driver's seat, spreading it over her. The woman's hands trembled beneath the fabric. "Axel," Miles said. The dog jumped into the cab immediately, settling at the woman's feet. He pressed his warm body close, radiating heat without crowding her. It was something he'd learned on his own. Miles climbed back into the driver's seat, heart still pounding. "What the hell were you doing out here?" he murmured, more to himself than to her. The woman's eyes opened again, clearer this time. She looked at him, studying his face as if trying to place him in a half-remembered dream. "My name is Eleanor," she said hoarsely. "Eleanor Whitmore." Miles nodded. "Miles, you're safe now." She swallowed, gaze flicking briefly to Axel. Her fingers twitched beneath the blanket. "He's beautiful," she whispered. Axel lifted his head, ears tilting forward. Miles glanced at the road ahead. The storm showed no signs of letting up. Driving her to the nearest hospital would take too long. Hypothermia didn't wait. "There's a place," he said slowly, thinking aloud. "Not far. A cabin." Eleanor closed her eyes again, exhaustion pulling her under. "Anywhere. Warm." Miles put the truck in gear. As they pulled back onto the road, the headlights swallowed the storm once more. Behind them, the place where Eleanor had fallen disappeared beneath fresh snow, as if it had never existed. But something had changed. Miles felt it settle into the cab alongside the cold and the wind, a quiet certainty he hadn't known he was missing. Tonight he wasn't running, he was bringing someone home. The road narrowed as Miles turned off State Route 14, the truck's headlights sweeping over a rutted path barely wide enough for one vehicle. Snow lay thick here, undisturbed, as if no one had driven this way in days. The forest closed in on both sides, tall pines bending under the weight of ice, their branches groaning softly when the wind passed through. This part of Silver Pine Valley felt older than the town itself, a place where human presence had always been temporary. Miles drove slower now, one hand steady on the wheel, the other resting briefly against the dashboard as if grounding himself. Eleanor lay reclined in the passenger seat, wrapped in the thermal blanket and his coat, her breathing more even but still shallow. Her face had regained a hint of color, though exhaustion clung to her like a second skin. Axel remained at her feet, pressed close, his large body radiating warmth. His eyes stayed open, alert, tracking every sway of the truck. "We're almost there," Miles said quietly, though Eleanor was drifting in and out of awareness. He wasn't sure whether he was reassuring her or himself. The cabin appeared suddenly through the snow, its dark outline emerging from the trees as the headlights caught the edge of a wooden porch. It was a modest structure, built low and wide, with a steeply pitched roof designed to shed heavy snowfall. The wood siding had weathered to a muted gray, scarred in places by time and storms. Icicles hung from the eaves like frozen teeth, glinting faintly in the light. Behind the cabin, barely visible through the trees, the land sloped down toward a frozen creek, its surface hidden beneath snow. Miles cut the engine. The sudden silence felt immense. For a moment, he sat there, hands still on the wheel, listening to the wind push against the truck. He hadn't brought anyone here in years. The cabin had belonged to his uncle, Robert Carter, a quiet man who had retreated to the mountains after retiring from logging. Robert had taught Miles how to split wood, how to read the sky, how to stay calm when things went wrong. He had died alone one winter, heart giving out while chopping firewood. Miles had inherited the place, but rarely used it. Some spaces carried too much memory. Axel jumped down first, landing in the snow with a soft thud. He shook himself once, then turned immediately back toward the passenger door, waiting. Miles stepped out into the cold and went around to Eleanor's side. He opened the door carefully. The wind rushed in, biting, but Eleanor stirred. "We're here," he said. She opened her eyes slowly, blinking as she took in the dark shape of the cabin. "This is yours?" "Was my uncle's," Miles replied. "It's warm. That's what matters." He helped her out, one arm firm around her back. Eleanor leaned on him more than she probably wanted to, pride flickering briefly across her face before necessity overruled it. She was unsteady on her feet, knees weak, but she stayed upright. Axel stayed close, matching their pace, tail low but relaxed. The porch creaked under their weight. Miles fumbled briefly with the key, fingers stiff from cold. Then the door swung open with a long, familiar groan. The air inside was colder than he had hoped, carrying the scent of dust, old wood, and faint traces of smoke from fires long gone. He guided Eleanor inside and set her down gently in a wooden chair near the stone fireplace. The room was one large open space, sparsely furnished but sturdy. A rough-hewn table stood near the center, flanked by mismatched chairs. Shelves lined one wall, filled with old books, jars of nails, and faded photographs. A narrow hallway led toward a small bedroom and a kitchen nook. Everything looked frozen in time, waiting. Miles moved quickly now, muscle memory taking over. He knelt by the hearth, stacking logs and kindling with practiced efficiency. His hands worked despite the cold, striking a match and shielding the flame, until it caught. The fire crackled, then flared, sending a wave of warmth into the room. Eleanor exhaled, a long, shaky breath. "That sound," she murmured. "I forgot how comforting it is." Axel circled once, then lay down between Eleanor and the fire, his body stretched out, eyes half closed but attentive. Miles shrugged off his coat and hung it near the door, then returned with a mug of water, warmed over the fire. He knelt beside Eleanor and held it for her as she drank in small sips. "Thank you," she said softly. Her voice was steadier now, though fatigue still weighed on it. "You didn't have to do this." Miles met her gaze. "Yes," he said simply. "I did." She studied him for a moment, taking in his angular face, the faint scar along his jaw, the way his movements were deliberate, controlled. There was kindness there, but also restraint, as if he had learned to keep parts of himself carefully guarded. They sat in silence for a few minutes, broken only by the pop of burning wood and the wind outside. Eleanor's breathing slowed further, warmth seeping back into her limbs. "My hands," she said quietly, lifting them slightly. "They still feel numb." Miles nodded. "That'll pass. You were close, though." She gave a small, rueful smile. "I've been close before." He didn't ask what she meant. Some stories came out on their own, others needed time. He rose and fetched an extra blanket from a chest near the wall, draping it over her shoulders. Axel lifted his head briefly to allow the fabric to settle, then lay back down. "You trained him," Eleanor said, watching the dog. "Didn't you?" Miles glanced at Axel. "He was trained before me. Search and rescue. I just kept up." Axel's ear flicked at the sound of his name, but he didn't move. "He stayed with me out there," Eleanor continued, "before I knew where I was. That mattered." Miles swallowed. "He knows when someone needs help," Eleanor nodded slowly, as if committing that thought to memory. The fire burned stronger now, pushing the cold back toward the corners of the room. Miles checked Eleanor's pulse again, then stood and moved toward the small kitchen area. He filled a kettle with snow from a bucket by the door and set it to boil. "Once the road's clear," Eleanor said after a moment, "I'll find somewhere else. I don't want to be a burden." Miles paused, back turned. The word burden struck something sharp inside him. He turned around, leaning lightly against the counter. "You're not a burden," he said evenly. "You're a person who needed help." She looked at him, surprised by the firmness in his voice. Then her shoulders relaxed slightly. "All right," she said, "for tonight." That was enough. As the kettle began to whistle, Axel rose and walked to the door, ears pricked. He sniffed once, then gave a low, uncertain huff. Miles stiffened. He followed Axel's gaze to the window, peering out into the snow-filled darkness. For a moment, there was nothing, just swirling white and shadow. Then, briefly, a movement at the edge of the tree line, a shape, tall and indistinct, passing between the trunks. Miles narrowed his eyes. "Probably a deer," he said, more to reassure himself than anyone else. Axel didn't growl, but he didn't relax either. Miles closed the curtains and latched the door, then returned to the fire. He handed Eleanor a mug of warm tea, watching as color continued to return to her face. Outside, the storm pressed on, relentless. Inside, for the first time that night, the cabin felt occupied again. And whatever had been waiting in those woods would have to wait longer. Morning did not arrive gently at the cabin. It crept in slowly, gray and uncertain, pressing pale light through frost-laced windows as the storm loosened its grip on Silver Pine Valley. The wind still moved through the trees, but without its earlier violence, as if exhausted by its own rage. Snow lay thick and untouched around the cabin, smoothing the world into silence. Miles woke before the fire had burned low. He lay still for a moment on the narrow couch, listening. Years in emergency response had trained him to wake like this. Alert, aware of every sound that did not belong. The cabin was quiet except for the soft crackle of embers and the steady rhythm of breathing nearby. Eleanor slept in the armchair near the hearth, wrapped in blankets, her silver hair loose around her shoulders. In the low light, her face looked softer, younger somehow, the deep lines eased by rest. Axel lay stretched out at her feet, his broad chest rising and falling evenly, one ear twitching at the faintest noise. Miles sat up slowly, joints stiff from the cold. As he stood, something tugged at his awareness. Not a sound exactly, but the absence of one. He crossed the room and peered through the front window. Footprints. They cut across the clearing in a wide arc, half filled with fresh snow but still unmistakable. Heavy boots, deep tread, not deer, not Miles's. They led from the tree line toward the back of the cabin, then disappeared around the far side. Miles's jaw tightened. Axel was on his feet instantly, silent but coiled, his posture low and alert. He didn't bark. That worried Miles more than barking ever would. "Easy," Miles murmured, though his own pulse had quickened. He reached for the flashlight by the door and eased it on, angling the beam toward the prints. They were recent, within hours. Someone had been here during the storm. Miles glanced back at Eleanor. She was still asleep, unaware. He pulled on his boots and jacket quietly, unlatched the door, and stepped outside. The cold bit hard, but the air was cleaner now, sharp with pine and snowmelt. The footprints led toward the small storage shed behind the cabin. The shed stood crooked at the edge of the trees, its wooden panels warped with age, roof sagging under snow. Miles remembered it well. His uncle had kept tools there, axes, spare fuel cans, odds and ends that never quite found their way inside. Axel moved beside him, nose low, tracking. His fur bristled slightly along his shoulders. "Whoever you are," Miles called out, voice calm but firm, "this is private property." For a long moment, there was only the whisper of wind through branches. Then the shed door creaked. A man stepped into view slowly, hands raised, movements careful. He was in his late 50s, maybe early 60s, tall but worn down by years of hard labor. His shoulders sloped slightly, as though the weight of the world had pressed there too long. A thick beard, streaked heavily with gray, framed a weathered face marked by deep lines and a prominent scar that ran from his left cheek down toward his jaw. His hair, once dark brown, was now mostly silver and unkempt, curling out from beneath a faded knit cap. His coat was heavy but old, patched at the elbows, dusted white with snow. Beneath it, layers of flannel and wool suggested someone accustomed to cold. His boots were sturdy but mismatched, laces frayed. The man's eyes were sharp despite exhaustion, hazel, alert, measuring Miles with the caution of someone who had learned not to expect kindness. "Didn't mean any harm," the man said, voice rough but steady. "Name's Frank Doyle." Miles didn't lower the flashlight. "You picked a bad night to wander." Frank gave a faint, humorless smile. "Story of my life." Axel stood between them now, silent and watchful. Frank's gaze flicked to the dog, then back to Miles. He nodded slightly, acknowledging the unspoken warning. "I was walking the ridge when the storm hit," Frank continued. "Saw smoke from the chimney earlier. Figured someone might be inside. Didn't want to barge in." "You stayed in the shed," Miles noted. Frank shrugged. "Felt safer than knocking in the dark. Didn't know who I'd find." Miles studied him closely. He saw no aggression there, only fatigue layered over caution. A man who had learned to survive without making noise. "What were you doing in the shed?" Miles asked. Frank hesitated, then reached into his coat slowly, pulling out a dented tin mug and a small bundle of jerky wrapped in cloth. "Shelter, that's all." Behind them, the cabin door opened. Eleanor stepped onto the porch, wrapped in a blanket, her posture steady despite the cold. Her hair caught the light, silver against the white morning. "Miles?" she called softly. "Is everything all right?" Frank turned toward her, surprise flickering across his face. His shoulders dropped slightly, tension easing. Miles glanced at Eleanor, then back to Frank. "Stay where you are." Eleanor moved forward anyway, stopping a few steps behind Miles. Her eyes met Frank's, not with fear, but recognition. Not of him specifically, but of something familiar. "You were out in the storm," she said gently. "All night?" Frank nodded once. "Didn't have much choice." She looked at his hands, red, cracked, shaking slightly now that adrenaline had faded. "You're cold." Miles opened his mouth to protest, but Eleanor raised a hand. "No one should be turned away in weather like this," she said quietly. "I know what that feels like." Frank swallowed. His gaze dropped briefly. "I won't be trouble." Axel shifted, sniffing Frank's boots. After a moment, he sat. That decided it. Miles exhaled slowly. "All right," he said, "but just inside, warm up, then we'll talk." Frank nodded, relief flickering across his face before he masked it again. He followed them toward the cabin, careful not to crowd, hands visible the entire time. Inside, the warmth hit Frank all at once. He stood near the door for a moment, blinking, as if adjusting to something he hadn't felt in weeks. The fire had been fed again, flames steady and bright. "Sit," Eleanor said, gesturing toward the chair opposite hers. Frank hesitated, then sat, holding his mug tightly. Up close, the years showed more clearly. His hands were scarred, knuckles thickened from decades of work. His beard was coarse, uneven, the kind grown without mirrors. There was strength left in him, but it had been worn thin. "Frank Doyle," Eleanor repeated. "What do you do, Frank?" He huffed softly. "Used to be a machinist. Mill shut down 5 years back. After that, bit of this, bit of that, mostly walking." Miles leaned against the table, arms crossed. "You got family?" Frank shook his head. "Wife passed, cancer, no kids." His voice didn't crack, but something tightened behind his eyes. "Didn't see much point in staying put after that." Eleanor nodded slowly. "Sometimes movement feels like the only thing that keeps grief from settling." Frank looked at her then, really looked, and something in his expression softened. "Yeah," he said quietly, "that's exactly it." Axel lay down between them, stretching out with a heavy sigh. Miles watched the three of them, the woman who had nearly frozen to death, the stranger who had slept in a shed, the dog who trusted both, and felt the cabin shift around them. It was no longer just shelter, it was becoming something else. Outside, the storm finally began to break apart, clouds thinning, light growing stronger. Snow still covered everything, but the world felt less hostile now, less closed. Miles added another log to the fire. "Looks like you're staying until the road clears," he said to Frank. Frank nodded, eyes on the flames. "I won't forget this." Miles didn't answer. He just stood there, listening to the fire crackle, aware that the quiet inside the cabin was no longer empty. It was shared. The storm did not leave all at once. It loosened its grip in fragments, retreating in long breaths rather than a single surrender. By afternoon, the sky above Silver Pine Valley had lifted slightly, clouds thinning enough to let in a pale, watery light. Snow still blanketed everything, but it no longer fell. The world felt paused instead of hostile. Inside the cabin, warmth held. Miles moved through the space with deliberate purpose, feeding the fire, setting water to boil, checking the small propane heater in the corner to make sure it hadn't frozen during the night. His movements were efficient, practiced, but quieter than usual, as though he were learning how to share space again. Axel followed him closely, nails clicking softly against the wooden floor, his presence steady and unobtrusive. Frank sat at the table, elbows resting on the scarred surface, hands wrapped around a mug Eleanor had filled with hot tea. In the light of day, he looked older than he had in the morning. The harsh lines in his face were more visible now, carved deep by years of outdoor labor and long stretches of uncertainty. His beard, thick and uneven, framed a mouth that seemed unused to smiling. When he did smile, it came briefly, cautiously, as if testing whether it was still allowed. Eleanor sat near the window, a shawl draped neatly around her shoulders. Color had returned to her face, though she still moved carefully, conserving strength. She watched the men quietly, her eyes sharp despite her gentle demeanor. She had spent much of her life observing people at their most vulnerable. Old habits did not fade easily. "You didn't have to let me stay," Frank said after a while, breaking the silence. His voice was low, measured, shaped by years of choosing words carefully. "Most folks wouldn't," Miles shrugged. "Storm didn't care who you were, neither do I." Frank huffed a quiet laugh. "Fair enough." Axel settled near the hearth, stretching his long legs toward the heat. His coat gleamed in the firelight, black fur absorbing warmth, tan markings along his chest and legs catching the glow. At 7 years old, he carried himself with calm confidence, not the restless energy of a younger dog, but the grounded presence of one who had learned patience through experience. Eleanor's gaze lingered on him. "He's older," she said, "but he listens like someone who's seen things." Miles nodded. "He has." Frank studied the dog more closely. "Search and rescue? Used to be," Miles replied. "Same as me." Frank's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Fire?" Miles met his eyes. "Wildland." Something shifted in Frank's expression. Respect, perhaps, or recognition. "That'll change a man." Miles didn't argue. They ate quietly a little later. Simple food pulled together from what Miles kept stocked for emergencies. Soup warmed on the stove, bread toasted over the fire. It wasn't much, but it filled the space with something close to comfort. Eleanor insisted on helping, moving slowly but with purpose, stirring the pot, arranging bowls. Her hands shook less now. "Old habit," she said when Miles tried to stop her. "I feel better when I'm useful." Frank nodded. "That doesn't go away." As they ate, conversation came in small pieces. Frank spoke about the mill where he'd worked for nearly 3 decades, running heavy machinery, keeping things moving. When the mill shut down, the town had thinned out fast. Jobs disappeared. So did people. His wife, Linda, had gotten sick not long after. By the time she passed, there was nothing left tying him to one place. She liked routine, Frank said quietly, staring into his bowl. Sunday dinners, same seat at the table. When she was gone, the quiet felt louder than any noise I'd known. Walking helped, keeps the mind from circling too long. Eleanor listened without interrupting, nodding gently. "Grief needs motion sometimes," she said. "Stillness can be cruel." Miles said nothing, but his jaw tightened briefly. Axel lifted his head, ears flicking, then settled again. After the meal, Frank stood and glanced around the cabin. "I should earn my keep," he said. "If you'll have it." Miles considered him for a moment. "There's a generator out back that hasn't been running right, and the shed door doesn't close properly." Frank's eyes lit faintly. "I can take a look." He pulled on his coat and stepped outside, movements careful but sure. In the daylight, his body still carried the muscle memory of work. Shoulders set, steps measured. He moved like a man who understood tools and weight and balance, even if he hadn't used them in a while. Miles watched him go, then turned to Eleanor. "You all right?" She nodded. "Better than I was yesterday." She paused, studying Miles's face. "You don't invite people in easily." Miles leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "No." "But you did," she said. He exhaled slowly. Axel didn't object. She smiled faintly. "Animals know things we talk ourselves out of." Outside, the sound of metal clinking against wood drifted in through the open door. Frank worked steadily, testing the generator, adjusting something with careful hands. His movements were precise, unhurried, as if the act of fixing something allowed him to exist more fully. An hour later, the generator hummed to life. Frank stepped down inside, brushing snow from his sleeves. There was a hint of pride in his eyes now, subdued but real. Fuel line was frozen, nothing serious. Miles nodded. "Appreciate it." Frank hesitated, then said, "I don't know what tomorrow looks like, but I won't forget today." Miles met his gaze. "You don't have to." As the afternoon wore on, the cabin settled into a rhythm. Eleanor rested near the fire, Axel at her feet. Miles split wood out back, the steady crack of the axe echoing softly through the trees. Frank repaired the shed door, replacing a warped hinge, his breath fogging in the cold air. They did not talk much. They did not need to. This was the quiet work of staying, of occupying space without demanding anything from it, of letting warmth and presence do what words could not. As evening approached, the sky darkened again, not with storm, but with night. The fire burned bright, shadows stretching long across the walls. The cabin felt different, though, not fuller, exactly, just less hollow. Miles stood by the window, watching the tree line as dusk settled. Eleanor joined him, her movements steady. "You saved my life," she said softly. Miles shook his head. "You were already surviving." She looked at him, really looked. "So are you." He didn't respond, but Axel moved closer, pressing briefly against his leg. Outside, the snow held its silence. Inside, 3 lives continued forward, not with certainty, but with intention. And for now, that was enough. The road to the cabin came back to life 3 days after the storm. Miles noticed it first from the porch just after dawn, when the air still carried the brittle chill of night and the sky was washed in pale blue. The sound was faint at first, tires crunching slowly over packed snow, an engine struggling as it climbed the narrow ridge road. It was a sound the cabin had not heard in a long time, and it pulled Miles instantly out of the quiet rhythm they had settled into. Axel, now stretched out near the steps, lifted his head. His ears pricked forward, body tensing, eyes fixed on the curve of the road through the trees. "You hear that?" Miles murmured. Axel rose to his feet without a sound. Inside the cabin, Eleanor stood at the small counter, slicing apples with careful precision. Her strength had returned steadily over the past days. The color in her cheeks no longer faded by afternoon, and the tremor in her hands had all but disappeared. She wore a soft gray sweater Frank had, found folded in a trunk, likely his uncle's, and it hung comfortably on her frame. She looked, Miles thought, like someone who belonged here now. Frank was outside by the shed, tightening the last bolt on the repaired door. He straightened when he heard the engine, wiping his hands on his jeans. His beard had been trimmed that morning using a cracked mirror and borrowed clippers, revealing the strong lines of his jaw and the old scar along his cheek more clearly. There was still weariness in his eyes, but also something steadier, a man rediscovering usefulness. The vehicle emerged from the trees a moment later, a dark blue county SUV, its paint dulled by years of gravel roads and winter salt. It moved cautiously, stopping a short distance from the cabin. Miles felt a familiar tightening in his chest. "Company," Frank said quietly. Eleanor stepped onto the porch beside Miles, squinting slightly. "Law enforcement?" Miles nodded. "Looks like county." The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out, tall and broad-shouldered, his movements confident but unhurried. He appeared to be in his mid-40s, with close-cropped blonde hair and a face shaped by years of sun and wind. His jaw was square, clean-shaven, and his expression carried the calm authority of someone used to tense situations. The badge on his jacket caught the light. Sheriff Daniel Reeves. Miles recognized him immediately. Reeves had grown up in Silver Pine Valley, a few years behind Miles in school. They had crossed paths after the fire, too. Formal questions, quiet condolences, nothing more. Reeves had always been fair, but direct. A man who believed problems were meant to be addressed, not avoided. Reeves stopped a few feet from the porch, hands visible, posture relaxed. "Morning, Miles." Miles stepped forward slightly. "Sheriff." Reeves's gaze shifted briefly to Eleanor, then to Frank, then down to Axel, who stood alert at Miles's side. A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Still keeping good company, I see." Axel did not move. "We had a storm," Miles said evenly. "People needed shelter." Reeves nodded. "That's why I'm here." He glanced back toward his vehicle. "We got a report from town. Assisted living shut down last week. One of the residents didn't make it to the relocation center." Eleanor inhaled softly. Reeves turned toward her, his tone gentler now. "Ma'am, would that be you?" "Yes," Eleanor said, stepping forward. Her posture was straight, her voice calm. "My name is Eleanor Whitmore. I left on my own." Reeves studied her face, not suspiciously, but carefully. "You all right now?" "I am," she replied. "Thanks to him." She nodded toward Miles. "And his dog?" Axel flicked his tail once. Reeves let out a quiet breath, tension easing slightly. "I'm glad to hear that. We were concerned." Frank shifted where he stood. Reeves's gaze moved to him next. "And you?" Reeves asked. "Name?" "Frank Doyle," Frank replied without hesitation. "Passing through, took shelter during the storm." Reeves nodded slowly. "You've been doing some work around here." Frank glanced at the shed. "Keeps my hands busy." Reeves considered him for a moment, then looked back at Miles. "Mind if we talk inside?" The cabin felt different with Reeves inside. Not threatened, just observed. Eleanor poured coffee, her movements smooth, practiced. Frank stood near the window, respectful but watchful. Axel lay near Miles's chair, eyes tracking the sheriff quietly. Reeves accepted the mug with a nod. "I won't stay long." He took a sip, then got to the point. "Eleanor, the county can place you temporarily. There are options. Safer than walking highways in a snowstorm." Eleanor met his gaze. "I understand, but I won't go back to being shuffled from one place to another without a voice. I've done that enough." Reeves leaned back slightly. "And here? Is this what you want?" She hesitated only a second. "For now, yes." Reeves turned to Miles. "You okay with that?" Miles felt every eye on him. The old instinct rose, the urge to deflect, to keep distance. But he didn't this time. "She can stay," he said, "as long as she needs." Frank shifted his weight, then spoke. "I'll be moving on once the road's clear." Eleanor glanced at him. "Only if you want to." Frank gave a faint smile. "I'll figure that out." Reeves nodded. "All right. As long as no one's being held here against their will, I don't have a problem." He stood, setting his mug down. "But, Eleanor, we'll need to notify the county of your location. Just procedure." "That's fine," she said. Reeves paused near the door, looking at Miles again. His voice softened. "You doing all right out here?" Miles met his gaze. "Better than I was." Reeves smiled slightly. "Good. Silver Pine could use more of that." Outside, Reeves lingered a moment longer. "Miles," he added quietly, "if you ever think about coming back, fire response training, search coordination. We could use your experience. Miles didn't answer right away. Axel leaned into his leg. I'll think about it, Miles said finally. Reeves nodded, satisfied, and headed back to his SUV. The engine started, tires crunching as the vehicle turned and disappeared down the road. The silence that followed felt different. Not tense, but earned. Frank exhaled slowly. Well, he said, that could have gone worse. Eleanor smiled faintly. It went honestly. That matters. Miles stood on the porch long after Reeves was gone, watching the road where the past had briefly returned and then moved on again. For the first time in years, it hadn't pulled him backward. Axel sat beside him, solid and warm. Inside, the cabin held. The days that followed the sheriff's visit settled into a quieter pattern, the kind built not from decisions, but from repetition. Snow softened at the edges of the clearing, retreating inch by inch beneath pale sun. The creek behind the cabin began to speak again, a low, patient sound beneath the ice. Silver Pine Valley did not rush its healing, neither did the people inside the cabin. Miles woke early each morning now, not because sleep refused him, but because the day seemed to be waiting. He split wood while frost still clung to the ground, breath steady, muscles warming with the familiar rhythm. Axel stayed close, moving with the confidence of a seasoned companion, his coat thick and clean, eyes bright. At 7, he was past the reckless energy of youth, but there was strength in him still, strength shaped by purpose. Eleanor took to the morning slowly, wrapping herself in a wool cardigan and standing by the window with a mug of tea, watching the light move through the trees. She looked stronger every day. Her posture had returned to its natural upright grace, and her steps were sure again. There was order in the way she folded blankets, intention in how she kept the kitchen. It wasn't control she sought, but care. Frank remained longer than he had planned. He never said so directly, he simply stayed. Each morning he found something that needed fixing. The porch rail that had loosened over the years, the warped shutter that rattled in the wind, the old workbench in the shed that leaned too far to the left. Frank worked with quiet focus, sleeves rolled, beard flecked with sawdust, movements precise. His body remembered labor even when his life had forgotten direction. One afternoon, while Miles and Frank were replacing a cracked window pane in the shed, the sound of hooves reached them from the road. Axel's head snapped up. Miles shaded his eyes and looked toward the trees as a chestnut horse emerged into the clearing, steam rising from its nostrils and the cold air. The animal was tall and broad, muscles shifting smoothly beneath a winter coat that shone red-brown in the sunlight. A woman rode astride him, reins loose in her gloved hands. She dismounted easily and tied the horse to a nearby post. Her name was Clara Bennett. Clara was in her late 30s, with sun-browned skin and dark hair pulled into a practical braid that fell over one shoulder. She stood a little taller than Eleanor, built lean and strong, the kind of strength earned outdoors rather than in gyms. Her face was open, marked by sharp cheekbones and a straightforward gaze that didn't linger where it wasn't wanted. She wore a canvas jacket patched at the elbows and boots scuffed from years of riding fence lines. "Hope I'm not intruding," Clara called out, her voice warm but direct. "Sheriff Reeves said folks were back up here." Miles wiped his hands on his jeans. "We are," Clara smiled. "Good, I'm glad." She nodded toward the horse. "This is Jasper. He won't wander." Jasper flicked an ear but remained still, calm and steady, clearly used to waiting. Clara explained she owned a small ranch 2 miles down the ridge. She raised horses and kept an eye on the trail system during winter storms. She'd seen smoke from the cabin again and wanted to check in. "People don't usually come back once they leave this place," she said lightly. Figured something had changed. Eleanor stepped out onto the porch then, her presence drawing Clara's attention immediately. Clara's expression softened. "You must be Eleanor." Eleanor smiled. "I am." Reeves had talked, apparently, but not unkindly. They shared coffee inside while Clara warmed her hands by the fire. She spoke easily, without pressing, her questions shaped more by curiosity than intrusion. She told them about the valley, how the school was struggling, how the volunteer fire unit was down to 3 people, how storms like the last one kept revealing who was still connected and who had drifted away. Frank listened closely. "You need help with repairs?" Clara nodded. "Barn roof took a beating. I can manage, but an extra set of hands never hurts." Miles met Frank's gaze. Something unspoken passed between them. "We can come by," Miles said. That afternoon marked a quiet shift. Over the next days, Miles and Frank worked at Clara's ranch, fixing what winter had broken. Frank moved through the barn with ease, his hands steady on tools, his confidence returning piece by piece. Clara noticed. "You've done this a long time," she said once, watching him brace a beam. Frank shrugged. "Long enough to miss it." Miles helped where needed, but he also found himself talking, really talking, for the first time in years. Clara didn't pry. She listened. She spoke of fires she'd seen crest the hills years ago, of neighbors who didn't come back afterward. Loss was familiar to her, too. It didn't frighten her. Back at the Bower cabin, Eleanor began something new. She set up a small table near the window with bandages, antiseptic, and a handwritten sign. Basic first aid, free. It was simple at first. Clara came by with a cut finger. A ranch hand followed with a twisted ankle. Word traveled the way it always did in small places. Quietly, person to person. Eleanor worked with gentle authority, her hands confident, her voice calm. She asked questions. She remembered names. She never rushed. Axel lay nearby during every visit, a steady presence, his amber eyes tracking movement without alarm. People trusted him. He trusted them back. One evening, after the visitors had gone and the fire burned low, Miles sat at the table, rubbing tired hands together. Frank leaned back in his chair, boots stretched toward the hearth. "This place feels different," Frank said. "Doesn't it?" Miles nodded slowly. "It does." Eleanor folded a towel carefully, setting it aside. Places change when people stop passing through and start staying. Miles looked around the room, the worn walls, the repaired windows, the light that stayed on long after dark now. For the first time, the thought didn't tighten his chest. Later that night, as Miles stood outside with Axel, looking at the stars spread thick above the ridge, he realized something quietly profound. The past had stopped knocking, not because it was gone, but because it had finally been answered. Axel sat beside him, tail thumping once against the porch. Inside, Eleanor hummed softly as she prepared for the next day. Frank cleaned tools with careful attention. Down the ridge, Clara's ranch lights glowed faintly, a reminder that connection did not have to be loud to be real. The cabin did not promise permanence. Nothing did, but it offered something better, a reason to wake up. Spring reached the ridge the way it always did, quietly, without asking permission. The snow retreated in uneven patches, revealing dark earth and flattened grass beneath. Meltwater traced narrow paths down the slope behind the cabin, feeding the creek until its voice grew stronger, brighter. Mornings carried the scent of wet pine and wood smoke. The long winter loosened its hold, and Silver Pine Valley breathed again. Miles stood on the porch just after sunrise, a mug of coffee warming his hands. He watched Axel trot across the clearing, nose low, investigating the new smells left behind by thawing ground. The German shepherd moved with easy confidence, muscles rolling beneath his coat, tail swaying slowly. At 7, Axel had settled into himself. He no longer rushed toward everything new. He measured first, chose carefully. Inside the cabin, life moved with a rhythm that felt earned. Eleanor sat at the table, ledger open, glasses perched low on her nose. She had begun keeping notes: who stopped by for first aid, which supplies were running low, which names belonged to which faces. Her handwriting was neat and deliberate, shaped by years of charting patient care. She looked content, her posture relaxed, her presence grounding. She no longer asked where she would go next. The question had quietly answered itself. Frank came in from the shed carrying a box of finished hinges, wiping his hands on a clean rag. He had trimmed his beard again, keeping it short now, gray threaded evenly through brown. The deep lines in his face remained, but they no longer looked carved by fatigue alone. Purpose did that, reshaped a man without erasing his past. "Clara'll want these by noon," Frank said. "Barn doors are finally square." Eleanor smiled. "She'll be pleased." The sound of an engine reached them a moment later, steady and familiar. A dusty pickup rolled up the drive, stopping near the porch. Clara stepped out, boots hitting the ground with practiced ease. She wore a denim jacket this time, collar turned up against the cool morning air. Her hair was braided tight, no loose strands today. Behind her, Jasper stood tied to the post, head lowered, patient as ever. Clara nodded toward Miles. "You ready?" Miles took a breath. "Yeah." Today was the first volunteer fire response training he'd agreed to lead since the Cedar Creek fire. Reeves had called again, not to pressure, just to ask. Clara had been the one to say it out loud. "You don't have to carry it alone," she'd told him, "but you don't get to disappear either." The words had landed where excuses couldn't. They drove down into town together later that morning. The old firehouse smelled of oil and dust, but it was alive again. Voices echoing, boots scuffing the floor. The volunteers were a mixed group: a retired schoolteacher with a limp, a young mechanic barely out of his teens, a rancher with hands like iron clamps. They listened when Miles spoke. Not because he raised his voice, but because he didn't waste words. Axel stayed near the door, calm and watchful, accepting a scratch here and there, allowing the children to sit near him while their parents trained. He lay down eventually, chin on paws, content. Back at the cabin, Eleanor welcomed visitors throughout the afternoon. A woman with a burn from a cooking accident. A boy with a splinter lodged deep in his palm. Eleanor worked with quiet authority, her voice soothing, her touch sure. She taught as she treated, explaining why she cleaned a wound the way she did, how to wrap without cutting off circulation. "This is how we look after each other," she said simply. As evening approached, Frank returned from Clara's ranch with a grin he didn't try to hide. "She offered me steady work," he said, setting his hat down. "Maintenance, repairs, year-round, if I want it." Eleanor looked up. "Do you?" Frank considered the room, the fire, the light, the familiar weight of belonging. "Yeah," he said softly. "I do." The knock came just before dusk. Miles opened the door and to find a man standing uncertainly on the porch. He was in his late 30s, lean and tense, with dark hair that had begun to thin at the temples. His jacket was too light for the evening chill. His eyes were rimmed red, not from cold alone. "Eleanor Whitmore?" the man asked. Eleanor stepped forward, breath catching. She recognized him instantly. "Daniel?" Her son looked older than she remembered, harder. The easy smile from the photograph in her suitcase was gone, replaced by something cautious, fragile. His beard was patchy, unkempt, and his hands trembled slightly as he held them at his sides. "I heard you were up here," Daniel said. "Sheriff Reeves told me. He swallowed. "I didn't know if you'd want to see me." Eleanor closed the distance between them and placed her hand over his. Her touch was steady. "I've wanted to see you every day," she said. Daniel's shoulders sagged. "I'm trying to get clean," he admitted. "It's not easy." "It rarely is," Eleanor replied. "But you came." Miles stepped back, giving them space. Axel moved closer, sniffed Daniel's boots once, then sat. The dog's calm presence did more than words ever could. They talked late into the night. Daniel spoke haltingly of mistakes, of lost years, of the long road ahead. Eleanor listened without judgment, asking only what he needed. "A chance," Daniel said finally. "You have one," she said, "but you'll earn the rest." He nodded, tears tracking silently down his face. When Daniel left that night, promising to return the next day, the cabin felt fuller, not crowded, but complete. Later, as the fire burned low, Miles stood at the window again. The ridge was quiet, stars scattered bright above the trees. Axel sat beside him, tail thumping once, slow and satisfied. Clara joined him, leaning lightly against the doorframe. "You did good today," Miles exhaled. "We all did." The light in the cabin stayed on long after the valley darkened, not as a signal, as a choice. Sometimes God does not arrive with thunder or fire. He comes quietly, in the form of a stranger who stops when it would be easier to keep driving, in the loyalty of a dog who refuses to leave someone in the cold, in a warm light left on in a cabin when the world feels too dark. This story reminds us that miracles are not always loud. They happen when broken people choose kindness over fear, when someone opens a door instead of closing their heart, when love shows up exactly where it is needed most. In our everyday lives, we pass quiet miracles all the time: a neighbor who listens, a hand that helps, a moment where we choose compassion instead of turning away. These are the moments God uses to heal what we think is beyond repair. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us where you were watching from. We'd love to pray for you. And if you believe that no one, human or animal, should ever face fear alone, subscribe to this channel for more stories of faith, compassion, and second chances. May God bless you and your family. May He protect those who feel forgotten tonight. and may his quiet miracles find you right where you are. Amen.